area is very wide, so we need to know more about the disaster knowledge. So accumulation and elimination is our aim. Many architects have to go to the disaster stricken areas, but it is so wide and various cities and the fishermen's villages in a mountain and so on. So it is very difficult to go in a good balance. So the arcade want to be a kind of platform to work with the architect in disaster stricken area. So this is a simple action about arcade as a platform to archive their works, to exchange the information about the actions and evaluate it, the actions. This is a map of Honshu Island. The epicenter is here, the Sendai is here, Fukushima is there. And we put some project in, of course, in the stricken area, but in the other special actions in Tokyo or Nagoya or Osaka. I will show you some project by the arcade. This is a special open desk. The Tokyo University campus was broken, so we closed the whole campus and postponed every educational schedule to 2 months. So during these 2 months, students have to go back to their home. No library, no laboratory, and no educational services. So some design firms in Tokyo or Osaka and Nagoya invite the student and have a special activity with them. That is at the open desk. And another activity is, it's one typical one, in Kamaishi city in Iwate prefecture. He is an architect, Toyo Ito, and the other architects and the landscape designers and city planners went into the Kamaishi city and worked with the local government and a workshop. As you know, the Japanese local government is very small and limited, limited to the routine works. So this is out. This kind of situation is out of their role. So we have to keep help them and make some plans. This is another activity, model of recovery. It is a very this town. We made a white model of the town in a 1/500 scales, very in detail. That we checked about the shape of each house and the trees and the curve of the road and so on. So we saw the models to the model of the lost cities and share this model with the resident of the town. They are almost crying and they say, this is my house, this is my friend's house, this is a restaurant, I went there every time. And this is a special workshop to paint it. The house of mine has a red roof, this shop has a blue facade and so on. It's a very good chance to care the broken heart of them. Now we have another exhibition in Tokyo, these lost models, and the similar activities to draw a future vision of each of them. And one of the biggest activity of we have had as an arcade is Oshika Peninsula workshop in 5 days. The peninsula area is like that. They have more than 20 bays. Each bay has a small fisherman's village. Almost all are lost. But each bay is very small and the local government cannot reach every bay. So we organize the 15 laboratories of universities from all over the world and make 5 days workshop to go there. We stayed in a shelter building in the gymnasium. They bring their own sleeping bags and the food for 5 days and stay there. The day first, they go to the stricken area, and day two, they talk with residents there. Most of them evacuate from that village, so the fieldwork team goes to the shelters and talk with. They bring the big models from each city and draw a plan, a very quick work, but based on a conversation with the residents, and show a presentation at the village and exchange ideas. And day 5 is we get together again and share what's happened in each bay and what can we do for the future plan of that. Around 100 students and architects come together. City mayor joined that vision. After that, we combine the proposals of each laboratories, including the fieldwork report and the interviews with the residents and the current conditions and the proposals and some proposals with the business and so on. So after that, the Ishinomaki local government used our report to make their own recovery plan. So it's not just a student's work, but a very practical, actual plan. And we follow the process to realize that plans. We also have another exhibition about the Ishinomaki Peninsula in another cities, and have a workshop, and we invite some residents in stricken area to talk with the students. And finally, now, this is a very new diagram, especially in Sendai city. At that night, around 100,000 people go to shelter because their houses, they feel the house is not safe. But after that, some goes back to home, some evacuate to other cities, and around 20,000 people still remained in shelters. And after, we have another way to provide some houses, but in 1 month, still 3,000 people in a shelter. But we close the shelter because we provide, we mean the government now, the temporary housings and subsidized temporary housings are there. Now we are around here, many people living in a temporary housing, and now we are planning recovery houses for the permanent living. This is a the very typical temporary housing. It's in Japan, right? It's like a very grid system. They say the speed is important. I know. But how do you think about the quality of life and the quality of the community of life? And this is a planned recovery housing in 1912. They say the speed is important, I know, but we are an architect, we can do more better houses in same schedule and the same cost, of course, so we have to help them. And we have planned some competitions about public buildings for the nursery school and some other schools and so on. Local government cannot organize these kind of competitions, so we help them to make more better public buildings like this. Recovery process is still working, and we have to have a lot of work as an architect, a network of architects to rebuild the more better living conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mutue. Actually, just right after earthquake and tsunami hit the area, I kind of felt like how helpless the architect is, meaning we can't really prevent that happens. But then after that, we kind of learned that the design or the architecture is such a positive action, so that we can actually help to do something very positive. So certainly that Professor Motoe and Akiera activity is helping to really generate the future vision, which is necessary to give a hope. So thank you for sharing with us about your activity. So today, the last person I introduce is today's discussant, Mr. Christopher Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne from Los Angeles Times. Actually, many of you might read the article featured yesterday at the Los Angeles Times, the story about this current condition of the area based on his recent trip to Japan. So he will help summarize today's lecture, and we will try to connect probably this connected all with his recent visit to Sendai. So please welcome Christopher Hawthorne.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me first offer sincere thanks to Dr. Burns and the staff of the Fowler for organizing and hosting this event this afternoon. And I think special thanks to Hitoshi, my friend, for inviting me to offer some comments, but also for his help in arranging and helping me prepare for my trip to Japan last month. And it really would have been impossible for me to do the kind of reporting that I did without his assistance and his wisdom. So thank you. And last, let me thank a couple of the speakers whom you've already heard from, Mr. Terashima and Professor Motoe, who were both very gracious in meeting with me while I was in Sendai in February, and as with Hitoshi, were really instrumental in helping me understand the scope of this disaster and begin to think about how the recovery process is moving forward. So Hitoshi asked me to offer a bit of a summary of what we've heard and also relate some of the insights that we've heard from the previous speakers to some of what I saw and wrote about while I was in Japan, and I feel really privileged to be able to do that. I spent a week in Northeast Japan the first week of February, and I had one piece in yesterday's paper, as Satoshi mentioned, and I'll have a couple follow-up stories on more specific issues. The first piece was really a kind of overview of the recovery process and some of the obstacles that it's facing, and I'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon. But I'm also working on a piece on plans for memorials and monuments to mark the disaster, and a story about the role, more specific look at the way that architects have tried to be engaged in this recovery process, and what that says about the possibilities for architects who I think increasingly around the world are interested in being engaged in this kind of post-disaster recovery and trying to bring their skills to bear, which can be considerable given the way they can synthesize a lot of different fields and both talk to community members who become their clients and also to those with technical experience like engineers, as well as elected officials. And so my work on this trip is not done, but it was a remarkable trip, and it was remarkable to see the extent of the damage that is still visible at that point 11 months after the disaster. And for me, it was very helpful to have had the experience of writing about some other disasters and the recovery process, particularly two in this country, the attacks of September 11, 2001, of course, in New York, where we've had a long, protracted rebuilding process, which has been politically fraught in many ways. And then Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, which hit the Gulf Coast in 2005. And in fact, our editor at the time at the LA Times, Dean Baquet, who now as an editor at the New York Times. When that hurricane hit, I got a call from my editor saying that Dean was going to send me to New Orleans right after the hurricane hit. And I think because Dean Baquet comes from a family that has lived in New Orleans for generations, he understood that the story would not just be a story about disaster, and the recovery story would really be one about culture and architecture and ecology. So he actually, to his great credit, sent a whole team of us to the Gulf Coast right in the wake of the hurricane. So I went as the architecture critic. We had science reporters, and I spent a week there while the city was mostly still. New Orleans was still mostly underwater, and I think those two experiences helped me think about the process of understanding what's happened in Japan. So. Before I get into some themes that have emerged, I want to say that I think as Satoshi mentioned, the teenage boy who was in Miss Mabuchi's video is really the star of the afternoon in many ways. From my point of view, I think he really exemplifies the resilience and the generosity of spirit that I witnessed when I was in Japan. It's really remarkable how many people in such dire circumstances, having seen so much destruction, continue to have that kind of optimism and I think really thoughtfulness about what the disaster means for them and for their communities. So in terms of what we've heard and what I saw when I was there, I think what we've heard from almost all of the speakers is that the preparedness in Japan and the immediate response to the disaster were both exemplary and really have both set a kind of global standard. And also offer us in California a lot of lessons for thinking about preparing for earthquakes and other disasters here and how we can be better prepared and think more systematically about how a city like Los Angeles might respond to an earthquake of this incredible scale. But I think addressing and resolving questions about how and where to rebuild has turned out to be a much more difficult process, as you might guess. And what I found is that what many architects and others and community members told me when I was in the region is that the recovery in some ways is stalled, and there are a lot of difficulties addressing some of the trickier questions, which I'll talk about briefly. There have been, it's important to say, though, some real success stories. I think the example of Sendai, which despite the flooding along the coastline, stayed mostly dry, and the decisions that have already been made in Sendai about prohibiting construction in a strip along the coast nearly a kilometer wide, I think are an exception to this sense that the trickier questions about rebuilding have been put off. In some parts of the disaster area, Sendai has, I think, pulled together an unusual kind of consensus about saying there are certain parts of the coast where it doesn't make sense to rebuild, and we're actually going, as a city government, we're going to prohibit reconstruction in those areas. And then the projects, some of the ArchiAid projects that Professor Motoe just shared with you, I think were very impressive to me. I was lucky enough to sit in on a design competition for one of the schools that he mentioned, which I wrote about in my piece. And the winning design for that school, for that middle school, that junior high, by the Tokyo architect Kumiko Inui, is really an impressive piece of work compared to the kind of architecture I've seen in those other areas that I've talked about. But in some other locations, towns like Onagawa and the fishing villages along the Oshika Peninsula, I think there has been a lot less. Finding that kind of consensus has been very tricky. The mayor of Onagawa, in fact, had a preliminary plan to consolidate some of the villages that it oversees, and that mayor was pretty quickly forced from office and replaced by a mayor who's now pledged to rebuild every one of those villages because there are a lot of people who want to remake their lives there, even if it economically might not make sense for the region. And I think that's the really tricky question that the recovery process is facing now. Malka Older talked about fairness and this inherent, this sort of deep sense of fairness in Japanese culture, which is something that I noticed quite a bit in my visit. And I think the question is, what happens when it becomes impossible in some of these villages and towns to craft a rebuilding plan that is fair to everyone? And how do you begin to make those tough decisions? And the toughest question specifically is in some of these fishing villages that were losing population before the disaster, does it make sense to rebuild those communities at the size that they were, given sort of demographic shifts that are happening? And what a lot, and to wrap up, I think what a lot of people expressed to me in my conversations with them in Japan is that this disaster has also, putting aside the question of how and where to rebuild, the disaster has really exposed a lot of already existing fissures in Japanese culture, some gaps between rich and poor. Of course, there's nothing like the levels of inequality that we have in this country, but perhaps makes talking about them in Japan all the trickier, between older and younger populations, between urban and rural, and so forth. And I think another thing many people told me is that conversation is perhaps overdue for Japan, but is also quite useful and even healthy for the culture moving forward. So thanks again to all of our speakers for your insight and your thoughts, and thanks again to Hitoshi and to the Fowler for helping put together this symposium today. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. Actually, it is fun. I really appreciate that the piece you wrote, and also I really appreciate that your intention and the Los Angeles Times intention trying to keep sort of telling the story of Japan. And as the time goes by, of course, these kind of things fade, especially in a foreign country. But I still believe it's very important to keep talking about this because this might happen here also, and there's a lot of things that you can learn from this incident. I was initially thinking about taking Q&A, but due to the time, I have to give up to do it. But there will be the reception upstairs, and all of our speakers will be there. So please join us at the reception or opening reception of this exhibition upstairs. And you have a chance to speak to these individuals and ask specific questions to all of us, actually. And again, please give another round of applause to our great speakers. And also, I'd like to say thank you to all Fowler Museum, also the member of Terasaki Center. Thank you very much.